Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church in Columbia, South Carolina, where we're part of the ELCA. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. It was probably about 15 years ago when I went to visit one of my church members in the hospital on a Sunday right after worship. What that meant was that I was wearing my clerical collar for my trip into and out of the hospital. As I was leaving, it so happened that when the elevator arrived, it was a crowded elevator. There was room for me, just barely, but when I got on, there was no room to turn around and face the door like is normally done. So, as we made our way down, I was staring at all of them, and they were all, and I mean every one of them, silently staring at my throat where my clerical screamed, "Pastor!" About halfway down, as we stared uncomfortably at each other on that congested elevator, I smiled and said, usually when I see a crowd this size, I think about taking up a collection. I watched that group of people laugh all the way into the parking lot. Sometimes you just have to have fun in life. This week we are making our way through the life of the Apostle Paul. Most times we hear little snippets of his life, and our attempt this week is to put it all in order and to draw some implications from his life for our own faith. You may remember that yesterday we talked mostly about Paul's second and third missionary journeys, where he traveled around founding churches, founding churches in the various places he went, spreading the faith to Gentiles and teaching them about Jesus. As we move into today and the events that happen next in his life, it's time to talk about the collection. We begin with the observation that it was tough to be a Christian in those days. The Christian movement wasn't big enough to draw enough notice for a general Roman-led persecution of the Christians. That would come a few years later. In these earliest days, however, local persecutions were common. We've already talked about how Paul was repeatedly beaten, flogged, and imprisoned at various times. Local Jewish leaders were against Paul and the message he proclaimed, so they would often stir up town leaders with an accusation that Paul was disturbing the peace. And if you think Paul had it bad with Jewish leaders in those predominantly Gentile towns, imagine how bad things were for the early Christians in Jerusalem. There they had to worry about the Romans, to be sure, but also a large, zealous, and active Jewish presence ready to attack anything other than the faith they knew. So when Paul founded a church in a city, one of the things he did was to take up a collection for the Christians in Jerusalem. Paul seemed to think it was appropriate for these Gentile Christians to recognize that their faith had come about because the church in Jerusalem had sanctioned Paul to spread the news. Jerusalem was, in some sense, the mother church of the faith for them all. And on top of that, in Jerusalem they faced twice the troubles that those Gentile churches faced. So, Paul took up a collection to take back to Jerusalem to help out those there. As his third missionary journey ended, Paul was resolved to take what he had collected and deliver it to the Jerusalem church. When he got there, the Jews in the city had heard rumors about Paul, and in particular how he was preaching to Gentiles. So the other members of the church in Jerusalem suggested that Paul go to the temple and make the normal sacrifices of the faithful Jew in the hopes to calm the crowd down. However, when Paul got there, he was recognized before he could get into the temple, and the mob tried to attack him. And one thing the Romans valued above all was peace, and a Roman centurion nearby saw the mob and went over to disperse the crowd. He found Paul at the center of it all and asked what was going on, which gave Paul a chance to give his Christian testimony, which only inflamed the crowd further. When Paul told the centurion that he had Roman citizenship status, the centurion arrested him and placed him in protective custody. The next day, Paul was called before the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, but the end result of that meeting was that they wanted to kill him even more. The centurion placed him back in protective custody, and a group of 40 men vowed not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. When the centurion heard of this plot, he arranged for Paul to be transported to Caesarea under a large guard, where Paul was to appear before the governor of the region, a man named Felix. Felix decided to hear the case whenever Paul's accusers arrived. They did arrive 5 days later, but when Paul made his defense, he mentioned that he was a follower of the way, and Felix actually knew something about that. He delayed the trial again and again, and Felix and his wife Drusilla would come and listen to Paul preach. This went on for 2 years, while Felix hoped that someone would offer him a bribe to decide the case either way. Finally, while Paul was still in prison, the trial passed to a new governor named Festus. When Festus finally considered the matter of Paul and gave Paul a chance to reply, Paul availed himself of the right of every Roman citizen to have his trial heard by the Caesar in Rome. So that's where Paul was sent. Now that's the end of the story for today, but one might wonder why Paul wanted to go to Rome for trial. Well, it was a long shot, to be sure, especially because in Roman society the Caesar was considered to be a god. Paul seems to have thought that if he could convert the Caesar to follow the one true God, then he could convert the whole empire to Christianity at one stroke. In his mind, it was worth a shot, meager as it might be. Interestingly, Paul rather consistently wasn't concerned about living or dying. He often wrote that to continue living was good for those he was preaching to and for the opportunity to convert more people to the faith. Still, he also knew that if he died, he would be with Christ, and for him that would be better. So the chance to convert the Caesar should be taken, and whatever happened after that was fine with Paul. He was clearly a man of strong faith and conviction. Maybe our own witness to our faith could use some bolstering like that. May we tell the story of God's love in our words and in our lives. Thanks for sharing these moments with me, and remember to let this day belong to God.